31 patients went to sleep in a sealed ward. 6 hours later, the beds were warm and empty, and the door had not opened once. She had walked the rows at 2:20 because she always walked the rows at 2:20, and she had touched the foot of each bed as she passed and said the number under her breath the way she had since her first year. 31. At 8 in the morning, she walked them again, and the sheets were turned back and warm. There is no way out of Kestrel Ward. That is the entire point of it. It sits at the end of a single corridor behind a pressure door that logs every cycle, on a station where the outside is vacuum and the inside is counted, and the door had not cycled once in 6 hours. Maren checked the log herself, standing in the dark with the readout throwing green light up under her chin, and the log said what it had said all night. Sealed. She called it in. Security came, and then the station physician, and then a man from the administration who kept saying the word irregularity as though repetition would file it down into something manageable. They pulled the deck plates. They scanned the voids. They put a drone into the ventilation trunking and watched it crawl the whole run twice. There was nothing. 31 people had vanished out of a sealed room. They were missing, unaccounted for, and every one of them had been lying in those beds, some of them too ill to stand, one of them a 9-year-old girl with a fractured hip, and at some point between 2:20 and 8 in the morning, they had stopped being there. Maren said very little through all of it. She was thinking about the fact that she had turned the lights down at 3, the way she always did, and that the ward had been quiet, and that quiet was normal, and that she had not once looked up. They asked her about the medication logs first, which she had expected, and then about her sleep, which she had also expected, and then whether she had ever been treated for anything herself, which she had not expected but understood. Maren answered everything. She was calm in a way that seemed to unsettle them more than crying would have. When they finished, she asked if she could go back into the ward, and they said no, and she went back that night anyway, on her own time, because the numbers were wrong and she could not put them down. Here was the thing nobody else seemed to be looking at. 31 patients had gone. But Kestrel Ward held 40 beds. 9 had been empty at 2:20, and Maren knew exactly which 9, because knowing which beds are empty is most of what the job is. She stood in the dark and walked the rows again and touched the foot of each bed. The 9 empty ones were still empty. That was not the strange part. The strange part was that the 9 empty beds were not the 9 she remembered. Bed 12 had held a man with a chest infection. It was stripped and clean, and it had the tight hospital corners she had never in her life been able to make. Bed 34 had been empty for a fortnight, and its sheets were turned back and creased, as though somebody had just got up. Maren stood in the middle of the ward with her hand still on the rail of bed 34, and she understood that she was not looking at an absence. Something had been rearranged. Somebody had made a copy of her ward and got the details wrong, and she was standing inside the copy. She began keeping her own record that night in a paper notebook, because paper does not get amended. Every bed, every shift, the state of the linen, the position of the trolleys, the 4 bad casters on the 3rd trolley that made it pull left. Small things, unfalsifiable things. She did it for 11 days while the investigation went from urgent to careful to quiet, and while the station stopped talking about the 31 and started talking about the inquiry, and while the ward stayed sealed and empty and lit at half power. On the 11th day, the trolley pulled right. Maren stood over it for a long moment. Then she got down on the deck with a torch and looked at the casters, and all 4 turned clean and true, and the trolley was the same trolley in every visible respect, except that it was not. She sat back on her heels in the empty ward and made herself think it through slowly, the way she thought through a failing patient, because panic is a luxury for people who are not on shift. Something was replacing things, not stealing them. Replacing them with versions that were almost right, and the almost was the only evidence it left. Which meant the question was not where the 31 had gone. The question was how long this had been happening before the night it took people. She went back through her notebook to the first page, and then she went further back into the ward's own maintenance record, hunting for small, unexplained corrections, and what she found there made her stop and put the torch down and sit for a while in the dark. The corrections went back 19 years. Nobody had ever seen them, because nobody looks at a maintenance log as a whole. You look at the line you need, and you close it. Maren looked at all of it. A caster replaced without a requisition. A viewport seal lobbed as renewed by a technician who had been off station that week. A bed frame with 2 different serial numbers, 11 months apart, and no record of a swap. Individually, each one was the sort of clerical scruff that accumulates in any working building. Together they made a shape, and the shape had a rate, and the rate was accelerating. 19 years ago, it had been a caster. 6 years ago, it had been a whole bed. 11 days ago, it had been 31 human beings. Maren took it to the station physician and watched him try very hard to be kind to her. He talked about how strain presents, about how the mind reaches for pattern when it is refusing grief, about a colleague of his who had seen faces in equipment noise for a month after a bad shift. She let him finish. Then she put the notebook on his desk, open at the trolley casters, and asked him one question. If she was inventing a pattern out of grief, why had the pattern started 19 years ago when she was 6 years old and living on a different world? He did not have an answer. He also did not act, because there was nothing to act on, and Maren left his office knowing that she was on her own with it. That night, the pressure door to Kestrel Ward cycled for the first time in 11 days, and the log recorded no entry and no exit, and Maren was standing right there in the corridor watching it open onto nothing at all. She went looking for what had happened 19 years ago, and it took her one afternoon because it was not hidden. It was only old. Kestrel Ward was not the original. The station's first infirmary had occupied the same end of the same corridor, and on a night 19 years ago a seal had failed in the outboard wall and the compartment had lost pressure in under 90 seconds. 14 people. The record ran to 3 pages, written in the flat, careful voice of a station that had needed to move on. They rebuilt it. Same corridor, same footprint, same 40 beds, because the plans existed and grief is expensive and a station cannot run without an infirmary. It was not identical. The seals were a newer pattern. The trolleys were newer. The viewport sat lower because the frame had been reinforced, but from any distance at all, it was the same room. Maren sat with that for a long time. Then she went back through her list of corrections and set them beside the old plans, and every single one of them, all 19 years of them, was the new ward being nudged toward the old one. The caster that had been replaced was replaced with the withdrawn pattern. The seal, logged as renewed by a technician who was off station, had been renewed to a specification nobody had stocked in 12 years. The bed frame with 2 serial numbers had gained the number of a frame that was destroyed in the decompression. It was not building a copy of her ward. It was correcting her ward back into a room that had stopped existing before she ever set foot on the station. Patiently, one small, wrong detail at a time for 19 years, and 11 days ago it had got as far as the patients. Maren closed the notebook and sat in the dark a while. Then she thought, it does not know. Nobody ever told it. What is at stake here is 31 people, and a 9-year-old girl with a fractured hip, and the fact that nobody on this station is looking for them anymore. That was the sentence Maren wrote at the top of a clean page, because she had learned long ago that when everyone else has moved on, you have to write down what you are doing and why, or the days will quietly turn you into someone who has moved on too. She started going into the ward every night. She stopped touching anything. She sat in the chair by the door with the notebook on her knee and simply watched, and for 6 nights nothing happened, and on the 7th, she caught it. It was not dramatic. That was almost the worst of it. The sheet on bed 19 changed while she was looking at it, not a flicker, not a shimmer, nothing that would survive being described. It was turned back at the corner. Then it was turned back at the corner slightly differently. Her eye had not moved. Maren sat very still and understood that she had just watched something take a measurement and put the ward back approximately as it had found it. And approximately was the word that mattered. Whatever this was, it was not precise. It was working from something like a memory, and its memory was imperfect, and it had been getting bolder for 19 years because nothing had ever pushed back. She wrote down the time, she wrote down the corner. And then, because she had spent 22 years learning that the only real power a nurse has over an illness is to observe it more carefully than it can hide, Maren Okonkwo decided to make herself impossible to copy. The idea was simple, and it took her 4 days to build. If the thing worked from an imperfect memory of the ward, then the way to trap it was to fill the ward with details too fine for an imperfect memory to hold. Not alarms, not cameras. There had been cameras all along, and the footage of the night of the 31 showed 6 hours of a quiet ward with 31 sleeping shapes in it, right up until 8 in the morning, when it showed 31 empty beds and no transition at all. Cameras were part of what it copied, so Maren used things that could not be copied without being understood. She ran a length of surgical thread across the aisle at ankle height and tied it with a knot her mother had taught her, a fisherman's knot from a coastline 11 light-years away, tied left-handed because Maren was left-handed. She stacked 40 paper cups in a specific wrong order. She wrote a number on the underside of every bed frame out of sight, each one a digit of her own service number, reversed. Small human nonsense. Things with no logic to infer, only a history to have witnessed. On the 5th night she sat in the chair and waited, and at 2:20, because it was always 2:20, the ward changed. She felt it as a kind of pressure behind the eyes. When it passed, the thread was still across the aisle. The knot in it was a granny knot, tied right-handed. Maren looked at that knot for a long time, and then she began to laugh quietly with her hand over her mouth because she finally had it. It could not know her, it could only watch her and copy what it saw. 4 days later, the station announced that Kestrel Ward would reopen. The inquiry had concluded. 31 people were formally recorded as lost to an unexplained decompression event that the deck sensors had not registered, which was nonsense, and everybody knew it was nonsense, and the nonsense was going to stand because the alternative was a station that could not be certified safe. Beds were needed. There were patients in the corridors of the lower wards. On the 14th of the month, 31 new patients would be moved into Kestrel Ward, and Maren had until then. She went to the physician one more time. She brought the thread and the knot and the paper cups and the reversed numbers under the bed frames, and she laid it all out. And this time he listened, because a granny knot where you left a fisherman's knot is not a thing grief invents. He believed her. He also told her the truth, which she respected him for, that he could not stop a reopening on the evidence of a knot, that no board in human space would accept it, and that she had 11 days. 11 days to prove that something living in her ward was building a bad copy of it, and to do it in a language a board would accept. Maren walked back down the single corridor to the pressure door and stood in front of it. Behind it were 40 beds, 9 of them wrong, and a thread with the wrong knot in it. And in 11 days there would be 31 people asleep in the dark at 2:20. She had one advantage, and she knew exactly what it was. The thing copied what it could see, so the trick was going to be showing it something that was not there. She filled the ward with a lie. Maren spent 9 days making Kestrel Ward look occupied. She built 31 sleeping shapes out of folded blankets and saline bags warmed to blood heat, and she set them breathing with the slow bellows of spare ventilator bladders, and she ran the monitors off recorded traces so the room sounded the way a full ward sounds at night, that low arrhythmic music of 31 hearts not quite in time. It was crude. Up close it would fool nobody. But nothing had ever come close, and she was counting on that. Then she did the part that mattered. In the center of the ward, in bed 19, she put nothing at all. Sheets flat. Monitor dark. One gap in the middle of a full room. On the 10th night, she sat in her chair by the door and waited, and at 2:20 the pressure came behind her eyes and the ward changed, and Maren opened them onto 31 sleeping shapes and one empty bed. She had expected that. What she had not expected was the sound. From bed 19, from the flat sheets and the dark monitor, came the slow, steady rhythm of a machine breathing. It had copied the gap. It had looked at an empty bed in the middle of a full ward, decided that an empty bed was an error in its own memory, and filled it in with something it could not see, and therefore did not have, and therefore had to invent. Maren stood up in the dark and walked toward bed 19, and she was not frightened at all, because she finally understood what she was dealing with, and it was not a predator. It was something desperately trying to get the room right. She talked to it, that was all. There was no weapon on the station that could have touched it, and no argument that would have moved a board, and so Maren Okonkwo pulled her chair into the middle of Kestrel Ward at 2:20 in the morning and talked to the thing that had been getting her ward wrong for 19 years. She told it about the trolley with the 4 bad casters and which way it pulled. She told it that bed 12 had held a man with a chest infection who liked the blind left up because he wanted to see the planet. She told it that she was left-handed and what a fisherman's knot was and why her mother had taught her one. She told it, in the end, about the 31, their names, their conditions, the girl with the fractured hip who was called Ada and who had been frightened of the dark and had asked for the corridor door to be left open a hand's width, which Maren had done every night, which was not in any log anywhere, which nothing could have copied because nothing had ever been shown it. She talked until her voice went. And somewhere in the 4th hour, the door at the end of Kestrel Ward opened a hand's width and stayed there. Maren sat in her chair and looked at that gap of light on the deck for a long time. Then she said out loud, to a room she could not see, "That is right. That is exactly right." And she said, "Now give them back." The ward was silent. And then, one at a time, in no particular order, the monitors began to wake. 29 came back, not 31. Maren counted them twice at 2:20 and then a third time with her hand on the foot of each bed, and there were 29, and 2 of the beds held the shapes of people who were not quite people, breathing, warm, wrong at some level, below the reach of any instrument, the way a granny knot is wrong where a fisherman's knot should be. She sat with those 2 until the morning shift came. She did not report them as patients. She reported them as unknown, which cost her a great deal, and she stayed with them for the 11 days it took them to stop, and she wrote their observations down in her own hand the whole time, because somebody should. Ada came back. She asked for the door to be left open a hand's width, and Maren left it open a hand's width, and neither of them ever discussed the 6 hours, because the girl did not remember them, and Maren was not going to be the one to put them there. Kestrel Ward reopened on schedule. It runs today. The maintenance log still catches the occasional small correction, a caster, a seal, a serial number that does not follow, and Maren still writes each one down in a paper notebook. And there are 4 other nurses on this station now who write them down too, because she taught them how. She never gave it a name. She says a name would be a guess, and she does not guess. What she says, when the young ones ask her why she still walks the rows at 2:20 and touches the foot of every bed and says the number out loud, is that there is something out there that has spent 19 years trying to remember this room correctly, and that it has never once managed it on its own. Somebody has to keep telling it the truth. Somebody has to keep count. If you would have stayed in that chair, stay for the next story too. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. A new one leaves Earth every day.